The National Museum of Ireland's Folklife collection consists of thousands of objects, records and film archive material pertaining to the everyday lives of ordinary people living in Ireland during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of the traditional customs and practices reach back through the centuries as far as pre-Christian times, making the National Museum's Folklife collection unique in Europe. Folklife is the study of life and culture. It is a complicated web of craft and tradition, custom and superstition. It focuses on intimate and domestic history, relating them to past practices and observing how new elements are accepted or rejected, thereby changing culture through the years. For more than 60 years, efforts have been made to establish a National Folklife Museum in Ireland. The National Museum now has the opportunity to put its Folklife collection on public display for the first time. The collection of folklife objects in Ireland first started in the early years of the museum at the turn of the century. The policy at the time was to gather objects illustrative of the domestic life of the times which had recently passed away. Dr. Anne O'Dowd explains.
Folklife really means looking at everybody's, say, intimate and domestic history. So it's exactly what we do from the time we get up in the morning to when we go to bed at night, what we eat, what we wear, the houses we live in, and from birth to death, and the customs and the beliefs and the practices that we practice in our daily routine from birth to death. It reflects in one way how people lived. Some people might say the poverty of the people, but really it was in the ingenuity of the people, in being able to survive in the harsh conditions that they had to endure, especially throughout the 19th century, and then to be able to adapt and bring in new elements and new innovations as they were introduced, and especially the improvements as they came toward the end of the 19th century. The Folklife collection has thousands of objects, up to 45,000 at the last count. The objects would break down into categories such as traditional furniture, the dressers, settle beds, tables, chairs, beds. The core of the collection, which I like to look at, is the objects made from straw, from hay, from rushes, from wickerwork, things that were made from the materials that were found naturally. The area of basket making, something like 60 varieties of rods grown in Ireland, and each one represented in regional styles of basketry. The clothes the people wore, traditional clothing being manufactured in Ireland from wool or linen. The utensils used to cook food, the agricultural machinery, which is bringing us outside, boats, curragh types, cots, and anything to do with how people made a living in the area of crafts and trades, tradesmen's tools, blacksmiths, coopers, woodworkers, and the whole gamut from blacksmiths to watchmakers. The importance of the collection is in showing us how we lived and how we came to where we are now. Some elements of it can go back into prehistory. Some are thousands of years old, others would only be centuries old. But it's in the value of looking at tradition and how it can take in these new adaptations and changes, which makes this Folklife collection unique.
Efforts to establish a national folklife collection were initiated by Dr. Adolph Marr in the 1920s, when he was keeper of Irish antiquities in the National Museum. In the 1930s, with the cooperation of the director of the Irish Folklore Commission and with the help of a Swedish folk cultural mission to Ireland, a systematic approach to collecting was adopted and considerable numbers of objects were acquired. Collecting continued in the 1940s with the assistance of Dr. Kevin Danaher of the Folklore Commission. The collection's scope and content widened when Dr. Tony Lucas became director in 1954. The collection is now stored in Dangan, County Offaly. One of the key players, seen here on the right, who has helped museum workers to discover artifacts for the collection, is Jim Delaney. Jim is a folklore collector who worked with Dr. Lucas and his staff from the 1950s up to the late 1980s. Not only is Jim Delaney responsible for the collection of many hundreds of objects for the museum, but he also assisted the museum in amassing a unique collection of archive film, showing many of these objects being made. These archive films paint a picture of Irish folklife at a crucial time in this country's history, the 1950s and 1960s, a time when traditional crafts and skills were being rendered obsolete by new technology, their practitioners were dying, and in quite a few cases, knowledge and skills that had been passed down through generations were being lost forever. A most ingenious device for holding feed for sheep in the Shannon Bridge and Clonmacnoise areas of County Offaly up to the late 1940s was the sheep crib. It is seen here being made by the late Bill Egan of Clonfinlock near Clonmacnoise in June 1969. In some parts of the country, notably counties Cavan and Cork, owing to the lack of cohesiveness of the peat, mud turf was made. When the sod had been cleared off, the bog stuff, as it was called locally, was dug out with a shovel, thrown in a heap on the spreading ground nearby and levelled. James McCarthy of Bonanumara is seen here making turf in this film shot in 1957. The story of the skin-covered wicker boat, the Curragh, is as old as the so-called gods of Irish mythology, so said James Hornell, the foremost authority on Irish curraghs. Michael John Keneally of West Village, Inisheer, is seen here making a curragh for the National Museum in 1968. With the possible exception of the Dingle and Blasket fishermen, the Aran Islanders used the curragh more frequently than inhabitants of other coastal areas.
Folklife is the most exciting of all the divisions of the museum if it can be put together properly and put on display and excitingly and unashamedly interpreted. It really is all about what we are as a different island people off the shore of Europe with old traditions, using old natural building materials in comparative poverty, but with great dignity and great separateness. Every aspect of life, both marine, inland, farming, dairying, the whole essence of Ireland is contained in folk life. Because of our particular history, our non-tillage tradition, we preserved in this island for centuries. Old traditions, medieval traditions go on in our farming and religious practices and superstitions in Ireland. They are all encapsulated within folklife and the folklife collections. Nowhere else in Europe have you those old, medieval and older traditions surviving into the 20th century. The peasant in the field, or his wife, or the fisherman, their clothes, their garments, their furniture are in themselves reflections in everyday materials of grander, more expensive traditions which are preserved in other parts of the museum here in the art and industrial collections. So folklife is central to the museum. I think to some extent people were ashamed of the thatch, of being from the country. Now, after 70 years of independence, that is moving away. Part of that development, that maturing process, is a recognition of the importance of folklife, telling about who we were, what we are now, where we have come from. That's where folklife is of such a help. But it's only in that maturing process that folklife can now be said to become of age and will finally, thank God, get a proper, just museum exhibition of its own.